Her name was Alina of Runnenfield, though the town kept her memory sealed behind a clenched jaw of silence. They never spoke of the night they dragged her into the square, nor of the chains that chimed softly against each other every time she tried to breathe. That sound, the faint metallic whisper, will follow us through this entire investigation because it followed her too. It was the sound of inevitability. It was the sound of a verdict delivered long before trial ever began. When the crowd gathered, it wasn't curiosity that filled the air, but something quieter and far more dangerous: certainty. A woman had been accused of taking a silver clasp from her employer's chest. No witnesses, no proof, only suspicion. And in a world that feared a woman's ambition more than it feared injustice, suspicion was enough to build the scaffold, enough to summon the balance beam. Now, the balance beam trial was simple, hideously mathematically simple. A single wooden beam suspended over a floor of iron spikes or rusted blades. The accused was tied by the waist with a slack rope, placed atop the beam barefoot, and commanded to balance perfectly for hours. Any tremor, any falter of the ankles, any natural human weakness was interpreted as guilt. If she fell, the beams or spikes ripped into her legs. And the judges would not, because the pain they insisted was heaven's handwriting. On that night, Alina's chains clinked again as the magistrate read her charges. Those who knew her spoke of her as gentle, careful, timid even. But that didn't matter. The town needed a sinner to restore the illusion of order, and the balance beam needed a body to feed its reputation for fairness. They believed it was the perfect trial, the kind that punished only the wicked, because who but a thief, they reasoned, would fail to stand still. But the truth is crueler. For women of her class, stillness was impossible. Her fate had been sealed the moment a wealthier man said her name with a sneer. And as the torchlight quivered across the blade-tip pit below, Alina realized what all women accused of petty sins realized. She wasn't being tested. She was being displayed. The crowd murmured as two guards lifted her by the elbows and set her on the beam. The wood, smooth at the center but splintered at the edges, forced her toes to grip like claws. Her spine trembled beneath the cold wind. Yet the magistrate demanded calm. Perfect and human calm. The rope around her waist barely helped. It only ensured the fall would be slower, more theatrical, more effectively humiliating. The chains echoed again as she steadied herself, a small, nervous rustle that made the spectators lean in. And that's when the paradox revealed itself. This was a trial in name only, a performance, a ritual of control disguised as justice. The townspeople told themselves they watched because truth mattered, but they were really there for reassurance. Reassurance that the hierarchies governing their lives were natural, righteous, unbreakable. They wanted to believe that guilt left physical footprints, that sin made the body unstable, that moral impurities inevitably threw a woman off balance. That myth comforted them. It let them sleep. But myths have a cost, and that cost was etched into Alina's ankles, her shaking calves, her deepening breath as the minutes stretched into an hour. Her mind spiraled in slow circles, fear, disbelief, defiance, fear again. But she was not allowed to speak. Trials that relied on silence were always convenient. And still, the chains whispered. Every time her weight shifted, they responded. A soft clatter, a metallic confession, a reminder that she belonged to the state now, that she could not step away, could not demand a different judge, could not expose the hypocrisy of calling this a fair test. As the beam wobbled beneath her, the magistrate stepped forward and announced that the ritual served three sacred purposes. First, to reveal hidden truth. Second, to maintain divine order. And third, the one he said with the greatest pride, to protect the community from moral decay. His voice was deep and steady, but the crowd didn't hear him. They were watching her toes curl and uncurl, her arms stiffen, her lips tighten as sweat dripped off her chin. They were watching for the fall. And that's where our journey begins. With a woman forced into a battle between gravity and accusation. With a medieval community convinced its cruelty was holy. With a legal system so fragile that it relied on pain to feel legitimate. Tonight, we'll uncover how this trial worked, why it existed at all, and what happened when the women forced into it refused to break quietly. The balance beam was not just a tool, it was a language, a declaration of dominance coded in wood and steel. And as we unravel its history, those chains, soft, cold, unrelenting, will keep following us, reminding us of whose voices were shackled to silence. If you're drawn to these buried stories, these dark mechanisms of power that shaped our world, stay with us. And before we plunge deeper into the machinery of the balance beam, consider subscribing to the Crimson Archive. It's how you ensure that the forgotten aren't forgotten again, because their chains still echo, even now. Annalina's, hers are just beginning.
The chains whispered again when dawn bled across the square, thin and pale. Alina had survived the night on the beam, but survival was not the same as mercy. And as the first rays of light slid across the iron spikes below her, the magistrates prepared to verify her steadiness. That word, verify, carried a cruelty so polite it almost sounded administrative. But that was the doctrine of the balance beam trial. Violence so normalized that it required paperwork. The chains, still cold, trembled against her hip as she inhaled. That sound had become her companion, her enemy, her clock. The villagers believed it marked the passing of time toward truth. She understood it differently. It marked the stripping away of her humanity, click by click. To understand how the balance beam trial ever existed, we must dissect it clinically, the way its creators examined the female body as an object, a vessel, a potential threat. The mechanism itself was deceptively simple, a wooden beam raised waist-high, just wide enough for the soles of a foot, just narrow enough to weaponize balance. Beneath it, spikes or blades, blunt enough to tear, sharp enough to maim. They wanted the wounds to look like divine retribution, not execution. There was psychology in every design choice. Once the accused woman stepped onto the beam, her ankles bore the full demand of the ritual. Her muscles were forced into unnatural stillness. Every instinct urged her to recoil from the danger below. But the ropes at her waist prevented escape while doing nothing to prevent the fall. They had engineered a scenario in which the body betrayed itself. And then they called it proof. The official explanation was that innocence granted the accused serenity, the calm of the righteous. Guilt, on the other hand, agitated the soul, sending tremors into the flesh. It was theology masquerading as biomechanics, but it served the powerful perfectly. Balancing for hours was nearly impossible. That was the point. As Alina held her posture, Magistrate Odrin stepped forward. A man whose confidence came not from wisdom, but from the authority stitched into his coat. His role was not to find truth, but to uphold hierarchy. He surveyed her with calculated detachment, as though observing a tool he expected to break. "Begin the trial's inspection," he commanded. A guard struck the wooden post supporting the beam, sending a tremor through its length. It was allowed, even encouraged. They argued that life tests the righteous and a true innocent withstands all disturbance. The beam jolted. Alina's chains rattled sharply. A gasp rippled through the crowd. She steadied herself, somehow. But this ritual wasn't just about balance. It was about spectacle. It was a reminder to every woman watching that accusations could pull them into the same nightmare, that obedience was the only true shield. This was not justice. It was public pedagogy through pain. The motive behind these trials was an elaborate mixture of theology, fear, and political control. In an era where property defined morality, women were viewed as potential disruptors, capable of desire, secrets, rebellion. Even minor accusations threatened the fragile confidence of the men who governed the town. So they created trials like the balance beam to transform insecurity into structure. What frightened them? Women acting alone, women handling money, women moving through the world without permission. Thefts, affairs, broken oaths, these were the official charges, but the deeper accusation was always the same. She lived beyond her assigned script. And systems like these thrive not on proof, but on performance. As Alina's legs shook with exhaustion, the magistrates began reciting the official doctrine, not for her, but for the audience. The beam reveals what lies hidden, they intoned. If she remains steady, heaven protects her. If she falls, the truth condemns her. But here is the hidden mechanism beneath the mechanism, the psychological lever that kept the entire culture in place. The belief that pain could not lie, that wounds were moral sentences carved directly into the flesh, that suffering purified truth rather than destroyed it. When the culture accepts that lie, anything becomes permissible. The guards were instructed to pace beneath her, their boots scraping against the metal spikes. Each scrape made the chains around her waist shift, that cold rattle slicing through her concentration. That sound haunted the entire square, sharp, metallic, rhythmic, a reminder that she belonged to them. Even her panic was theirs to orchestrate. At the 2-hour mark, Alina's calves convulsed. Exhaustion crept up her spine. She had eaten nothing since the night before. The beam pressed into the arch of her feet like a blade. But still she endured. A cluster of women near the back whispered prayers, not for innocence, but for mercy. They understood. They all did. Innocence had never protected them. And that understanding was precisely why the trial existed. Women who recognized injustice could not be allowed to speak about it. They could not be allowed to gather power. So the trial broke their bodies first and their voices second. The magistrates signaled for the second verification. This time the guard shoved the post harder. The beam vibrated violently. The chain shrieked. Alina's knees buckled for a single heartbeat before she forced them straight again. The crowd gasped, then murmured, then fell silent. She had not fallen, not yet. For the first time, the magistrate frowned. This was not how the ritual was supposed to unfold. Most women fell by the first hour. The trial was designed for that. A quick collapse, a quick verdict, a quick reinforcement of order. Alina's endurance undermined the script. And when rituals face disruption, the powerful adjust the rules. Proceed to the moral test, Odrin announced. The moral test was not written in any official document. It was an unwritten permission, a loophole disguised as piety. It allowed the magistrates to interrogate the accused while she balanced, forcing her mind to fracture along with her body. They asked questions designed to destabilize, questions about her past, her secrets, her relationships, her sins. Anything to make her falter. The guard stepped closer, lifting a parchment. Alina of Run Field, he read, do you admit to theft? No. Her voice was thin but unwavering. The magistrate nodded to the guard. He struck the post again. The beam wavered. Do you admit to lying about your conduct with your employer's son? No. Another blow, another rattle of chains. Do you admit, Odrin said, stepping closer, that your imbalance is proof of guilt? Her breath faltered. Sweat ran down her neck. The question itself was a trap, a loop of logic designed to make any denial seem like desperation. But she did not fall. And in that moment, the balance being ceased to be a test of guilt. It became a test of their control. The chains rustled again, louder this time, as if the air itself sensed the shift. Something dangerous had entered the court, not from her, but from the possibility that she might endure long enough to expose the entire trial as a fraud. And that possibility terrified them, because systems built on cruelty cannot allow exceptions. Not even one.
The chains whispered again, sharper now, as if sensing the air tightening around Alina's defiance. By the 3rd hour, the balance beam was no longer a trial.
but a tension line drawn between two collapsing truths: her body's limits and their authority's limits. One of them would break, and the magistrates were determined it would not be theirs. What came next was not written in any law, nor blessed by any scripture. It emerged from a far older instinct, the fear of losing control. When cruelty becomes a system, it survives by improvisation. Odrin stepped forward, his boots echoing across the wooden platform, and addressed the crowd. If heaven protects the innocent, she will withstand what comes next. A murmur rippled outward, a dangerous sentence. Because when leaders invoke heaven, they're usually asking permission for what they already intend to do. He signaled to the guards. They approached the beam with a slow deliberation, their boots scraping along the metal edges below, sending a chill through the crowd. Alina felt the sound reverberate through her legs, and the chains at her waist answered with their metallic whisper. That same cold rattle, that same reminder, she was theirs. The guards extended long wooden poles toward her, not to strike her, but to tap the beam itself. A new form of disturbance. Not a jolt, a rhythm. A series of precise, controlled taps meant to unravel her balance from the inside. Each tap timed to disrupt the brain's sense of stillness. The kind of trick used not for justice, but for submission. Tap, tap, tap. Her ankles trembled. Tap, tap, tap. The spikes below shimmered in the sunlight, waiting. The crowd fell silent. The women watching held their breath. The men leaned forward, sensing a verdict approaching. And yet, she did not fall. Her body swayed, her knees buckled, but her core tightened with the ferocity of someone who understood the truth, that endurance was her only remaining language. She had no legal argument, no advocate, no proof to offer, only her refusal to collapse. And that refusal was becoming dangerous. The chains whispered again, louder now, like an accusation thrown back at her accusers. Before Odrin could issue his next command, an unexpected voice rose from the crowd. "Enough," whispered a woman near the front. She said it softly, but in the tense quiet, the words seemed to echo. Others turned. Another woman murmured the same, then another. Not loudly, not boldly, but distinctly enough that the magistrates heard it. A fracture, not in Alina, in the audience. For the first time, Odrin looked unsettled. He had spent years performing these rituals, years turning accusations into foregone conclusions, but he had never faced a possibility of disruption from the spectators. People rarely question systems that protect them. But now they were watching a woman refuse to collapse into the role assigned to her. And that defiance was infectious. He needed to regain control immediately. "Proceed," he barked. But something he had not expected occurred. A guard hesitated. For a brief moment, the thick silence in the square crackled with uncertainty. The guard's hand hovered above the post. His eyes flicked toward Alina's trembling silhouette, then toward the women in the crowd who now watched him with an expression he was not accustomed to seeing. Expectation. Not fear, not obedience. Expectation. The magistrate hissed his command again. The guard swallowed, raised the pole. Before it fell, the beam suddenly lurched. A collective gasp tore through the crowd. Alina pitched forward, her arms flailing, her ankles twisting violently. The chains yanked tight at her waist as her center of gravity shifted. Time split into fragments. The sunlight flashed across the blades below. Her breath ripped from her lungs. And then, she did not fall. At the last possible heartbeat, her foot slammed sideways, her heel scraping the wood, her fingers clenching the air. Somehow, impossibly, she steadied herself. The crowd exploded in chaos. Shouts, cries, gasps. a wave of disbelief rolling outward. Alina's chest heaved, her knees buckled, her head did forward. But she was still standing, still balanced, still alive. And that moment, that single impossible moment, shattered the ritual. Because it was clear to everyone watching that the beam had moved too dramatically to be natural. Someone or something had shifted the structure. The fall had been engineered, the trial interfered with. And the villagers realized what many had long suspected but never dared to speak. The balance beam was not divine. It was manipulated. The shock spread quickly, infecting even the magistrates. Odrin's face hardened into a mask of wrathful composure, but the muscles at his jaw twitched with naked panic. If the trial appeared rigged, if the spectacle lost credibility, then their authority, their doctrine, their entire political scaffolding would collapse with it. He needed a scapegoat. "Who touched the supports?" he demanded, scanning the guards with narrowed eyes. None answered. But the truth was deeper and more dangerous. The beam had shifted because its support posts had been loosened earlier, subtly, imperceptibly, not enough to collapse, but enough to sway violently under pressure. Someone had interfered with the mechanism. Someone had tried to ensure she would fall. And the crowd knew it. A young boy near the front whispered, "They wanted her to lose." His mother quickly shushed him, but several heads turned. Too late. The idea had already spread. The power of a system lies not in its cruelty, but in the belief that its cruelty is fair. And that belief, as fragile as a spider string, had just snapped. Alina felt a shift, not just of the beam beneath her, but of the world around her. The chains at her waist trembled again. But this time, the sound felt different. Not like a sentence, but more like a warning. Something irreversible had happened. The ritual had been exposed. Odrin stepped forward, his voice cold. "Reset the trial. She will remain until the truth reveals itself." But the crowd no longer looked convinced. They looked unsettled, suspicious. Some even looked angry. Women especially. They recognized what had almost happened to her, because it could have happened to them. And for the first time, the ritual spell was cracking. Alina's endurance had done more than challenge gravity. It had challenged the story the magistrates used to govern them. And that was the true offense, far greater than theft, or oaths, or secrets. Odrin saw all of this, and his next decision, the one he made in that moment of panic, would change everything that followed. Because when a system of cruelty feels itself slipping, it does not retreat. It escalates. And the escalation that awaited her, the one that no woman in Runenfield had ever survived, was about to reveal the darkest truth behind the balanced beam trial. The truth they never intended anyone to see.
The chains whispered once more, not as accusation, not as surrender, but as a final, fragile thread between Alina's trembling body and the world that had decided her fate long before this morning. That sound would follow her through the rest of her life, but in this moment, it followed everyone else too. Because after the beam's engineered lurch, after the crowds gasped, after the ritual cracked open like rotten wood, the magistrates found themselves exposed. And exposed power grows desperate. Odrin scanned the villagers with a hunter's stare. He saw doubt swelling in the air, the kind of doubt that cannot be unheard once spoken. The balance beam trial depended on faith, not spiritual faith, but social faith. Faith in the illusion that cruelty was impartial. Faith that women fell because they were guilty, not because the system demanded their fall. If that illusion collapsed, the entire hierarchy would shudder. So Odrin did what cornered power always does. He doubled down. "Reset the beam," he ordered, voice cold enough to freeze the breath of those nearest to him. "Reinforce every support. She will balance again, and she will stand until her truth emerges." But the villagers did not respond with the obedience he expected. There was shifting in the crowd, slow, uneasy,
A stir of bodies, as though something buried beneath the town's tradition was finally crawling to the surface. The women watched with sharpened eyes, the men hesitated, even the guards moved more slowly, glancing at one another with quiet uncertainty. Because everyone has seen the same truth in that impossible moment. The ritual was not holy. It was choreography. And someone had tried to force its final step. The guards tightened the supports, hammering metal bolts into place. Each strike sent a vibration through the wood, and Alina felt it travel up her legs like a warning. The chains whispered again, that metallic hiss slicing through the heavy silence. A sound she now understood as more than restraint. It was the heartbeat of the system itself, relentless, cold, self-preserving. They rebuilt the stage, but they could not rebuild the belief. And as they lifted her trembling form back into position, a voice rose from the crowd. Not loud, not rebellious, just brave enough. She shouldn't be up there. Another voice followed, then another, small sparks of dissent flickering through the air. Odoran's jaw tightened. "This is divine judgment," he barked. "The beam reveals the truth, and she—" But the villagers were no longer listening. They were watching her. The woman who had outlasted cruelty. The woman who had revealed the machinery beneath the myth. The woman who refused to fall. The guards propped her upright, but she slumped forward, her fingers digging into the beam. Alina no longer had strength, only will, and even that was splintering. Then the chains whispered again, soft, uneven, like a dying breath. Odoran saw her fall trend seize the chance. "Look, her time is ending. Her body reveals what her tongue denies." But the words no longer held weight, because the villager saw something he couldn't see or refused to. They saw a woman tortured, not tested. They saw a system losing control, not revealing truth. And something in the square, something in the collective heart of the town shifted. An older woman stepped forward, a midwife, known for delivering half the village's children. Her voice was iron. "This is not God's judgment. This is yours." The magistrate's face drained of color. A ripple of shock passed through the crowd, more electrifying than any jolt of the beam. It was the first open challenge spoken aloud in years, maybe in decades. And once spoken, it untethered others. The baker's wife murmured, "She should be released." A young man added, "The beam nearly collapsed." A cluster of farmers muttered, "The test is broken." And then the phrase, "No system of cruelty can survive. We saw what you did." The chains whispered, as though echoing those words. Odoran raised his hand to silence them, but his voice no longer commanded obedience, only irritation. "Enough," he snapped. "The trial continues." But the guards didn't move. For the first time, they were weighing their loyalty, not to justice, that had never been part of the ritual, but to the community they lived among, the families they knew, the women who might one day stand where Alina stood. Odoran hissed, "Strike the post." No one obeyed. And in that silence, thick, trembling, irreversible, the balance beam trial died. Not with protest, not with violence, but with the quiet refusal of people who finally recognized the truth beneath the ritual. Odoran stepped backward, breath shaking with fury. Without the crowd, without the performance, he was just a man, a frightened man, a man whose authority depended entirely on the belief that the beam could not be questioned. But it had been questioned, exposed, unraveled, and in that unraveling, Alina collapsed. Not off the beam, but into the arms of the midwife who rushed forward before the magistrates could react. The chains whispered as they loosened from her waist, falling slack, lifeless. No longer a verdict, merely metal. The villagers surrounded her, forming a human barrier. The magistrates shouted, threatened, invoked doctrine, invoked heaven, invoked the law, but none of it mattered. Their ritual no longer worked, because the truth was visible now, and once seen, cannot be unseen. And here is the echo that haunts us today, centuries later. Cruelty rarely vanishes because it is immoral. It vanishes because enough ordinary people finally refuse to participate in the performance. The balance beam trial faded from history soon after that day. It was quietly retired, quietly condemned, quietly erased. The officials blamed logistical flaws, not moral ones. They never admitted wrongdoing. Systems seldom do. But women remembered and whispered and taught their daughters to recognize when justice was a costume draped over fear. And still, the chains whisper. They whisper in every modern system that presumes guilt before hearing truth, in every institution that demands impossible stillness from people already trembling, in every ritual of control dressed up as fairness. The balance beam may be gone, but the logic behind it is not. So as we close this investigation, hold on to that sound, that faint metallic whisper that followed Alina through her trial, because it follows us too. It warns us whenever old systems try to rise again, disguise in new language, promising safety while demanding silence. And if you want to keep uncovering these buried histories, the ones built on fear, on doctrine, on the engineered spectacle of guilt, stay with us. Subscribe to Crimson Archive, where we drag the forgotten back into the light, not to glorify their suffering, but to understand the systems that created it, because the chains still whisper.